We live with more than 1 million white-tailed deer in this state, and they live with us. No other wild animal has been studied more, hunted harder, or cursed at more often. The way we feel about deer is usually related to pleasant or not so pleasant encounters, recreational preferences, or economics. And we tend to passionately defend our points of view. But just as you might have a valid opinion, so does an opposing argument. As the state's wildlife agency, we're responsible for trying to maintain a balance between the deer herd, the land, and the people. No matter what your views, encounters are inevitable. There are more than 12 million people in Pennsylvania, which places us 5th in population. Yet we're a small state, number 32 in size out of 50. Add to this equation one of the largest deer herds in the United States and more miles of paved roads than most other states, and you can see why the deer impacts on our daily lives. During this video, we'll look at white-tailed deer history and habits, its life cycle, and how it has adapted for survival in our changing landscape. We'll look at the impact white-tailed deer have had on you and me, our neighbors, and our community that has caused it to become such a controversial creature. Each spring, the size of our deer herd is at or near its lowest point of the year. Of the 1 million deer alive last Labor Day, about 600,000 have outlasted the hunting seasons and winter. The possibility of dying from starvation or exposure lessens with each passing day. 2/3 of the remaining population are females, and before summer's end, they will replenish the herd's losses through reproduction. About 400,000 fawns will be born in little more than a month's time, and by Thanksgiving, the deer herd will again swell to roughly 1 million animals. Deer are social animals. An adult doe usually travels with her fawns from last year, and possibly a female or two that she bore in previous years. 2 or more family clans may come together to feed, but they don't stay close to each other very long. Unrelated adult does tend to grow weary of one another at this time. By mid-May, many adult does are ready to give birth. A few may fawn as early as mid-April, and others as late as September, but they're the exceptions. Family groups break up at this time because pregnant does prefer to be alone. Some studies indicate the females prefer certain places for birthing. Others conclude it doesn't matter. Researchers believe this isolation is one of several steps taken by deer to ensure predators don't get them or their young. Delivering from a standing position or lying down, this process may proceed quickly, or the doe may labor for several hours. While in labor, a doe may lay down and get up several times. She often switches sides each time she returns to the ground to push. Every move, every muscular strain seems part of a coordinated effort to bring the fawn closer to its birth. When the fawn finally emerges, it's almost always born head first. A newborn fawn looks somewhat disproportionate. Its legs appear too long for its body, and its face appears too long for its head. Almost immediately after her fawn is delivered, the doe consumes the afterbirth by eating it. Then she licks the fawn until it's clean and dry. Both steps help to eliminate odors that might lead predators to the newborn fawn. At birth, newborn fawns weigh 6 to 7 pounds, but can range in weight from 4 to 8 pounds. One of the greatest challenges for a newborn fawn is getting to its feet without help. Fawns usually accomplish this within their first 30 minutes of life. But that's not to say things aren't still a bit shaky. For a while, the whole world wobbles. The protein-rich milk fawns drink while nursing helps them double their weight in 2 weeks and triple it in 4. A doe will lick her fawn to stimulate excretion of waste, and when they're passed, she consumes them. This process, which may be performed during every nursing session for the first few weeks, is believed to help deodorize fawns, making them less detectable to predators. After a few days, a healthy fawn will be able to outrun a man, and within 2 to 3 months, it will be able to survive without its mother. For the first several weeks of its life, a fawn avoids trouble by staying in one place and moving very little. The 300 or so spots on its coat help it to blend in with its surroundings. Does are not always near their fawns because they must eat regularly to satisfy the nutritional needs of their bodies. It's also believed that deer stay away from their fawns to keep odors and disturbances to a minimum in the areas where fawns are located. Otherwise, predators might be attracted. During the first week, a doe visits her fawn about 3 times a day. She returns with increasing regularity as they get older because their demands are greater. She often finds them by calling, for you see, from birth, fawns choose their own bedding site. Sometimes, restless fawns attract undesirable attention by calling for their parent. This bleating can lure humans and predators. People who find fawns can jeopardize the animal's future in the wild by taking it. They assume the fawn is an orphan or abandoned, but in reality, the young deer is simply waiting, sometimes impatiently, for its mother to return. A doe separates her fawns from birth until they're several weeks old. It's no doubt an insurance policy that guarantees something doesn't take all her fawns at one time. Fawn pairs and triplets are united with one another after about a month. They're also just about completely weaned around then. With time, they begin to play with and learn from one another. Their daily routine will pattern their mothers within another 4 to 5 weeks, and by autumn, the fawns will accompany their parent everywhere. While the does are in seclusion taking care of their fawns, adult and sometimes yearling bucks roam together in groups. Pairs and trios seem to be the rule in forested areas. Bucks often maintain these groups throughout the year, except during the rut or mating season, which is about the only time bucks come in regular contact with adult does. Bucks begin developing antlers in late March and early April, when a bony growth arises from pedicels or antler bases on the deer's forehead. Deer antlers are not horns, even though we often refer to them as such. Horns are a permanent growth, antlers are seasonal. Bucks shed them each year, any time from late December to late March. New antler growth appears to be triggered by increasing daylight hours. Once they begin to grow, the hormone testosterone is believed to play a key role in antler development. Studies have shown that antler growth and eventual hardening corresponds with increased testosterone production. As a rule, each set of antlers a buck produces will be bigger than the last until the deer is 6 or 7 years old. At that time, bucks begin to manufacture less testosterone. For their first set of antlers, bucks may produce anything from a single tine or spike up to 12 points. points are branches at least 1 inch long on an antler's main beam. Immature bucks, often referred to as button bucks for the button-like pedicels on their foreheads, won't produce their first set of antlers until they're almost a year old. Antler formation is one of the fastest controlled cell growths known to man, increasing from 1 to 2 inches a week, depending on the buck's age, health, diet, and genetic background. The new antlers are covered with a soft, hairy skin called velvet. Beneath it is growing bone, loaded with delicate blood vessels and covered with nerve endings. This bone's growth is dependent upon the availability of minerals such as calcium and phosphorus. While their antlers are in this seemingly sensitive stage of development, bucks appear to move cautiously, watching that their headgear doesn't smack into or get hung up on something. If a buck accidentally damages his velvet-covered rack, the antlers will most likely have a deformed appearance. Sometimes bucks knock off an entire antler. By August, a buck's rack usually has stopped growing. Then, as the buck's testosterone level increases, the antlers harden and the velvet coating loosens and cracks. The somewhat brittle velvet seems to bother bucks, so they thrash bushes and rub saplings with their racks until they're velvet free. This may take several hours or a day or two. Bucks have been observed licking blood and eating velvet that they rubbed from their antlers. Why is unclear. What's left by the time a buck is finished fussing with his headgear is a polished and sometimes very intimidating rack. Although genetics play a role in determining the shape of a buck's antlers, its size is influenced most by the deer's age and diet. 75% of our antlered bucks are taken each year by Pennsylvania's more than 1 million hunters. It stands to reason that if a buck doesn't have great survival skills, or isn't living on good soil that produces highly nutritious plant life, or land that isn't hunted, the deer has little chance of having a big rack. Each year, 15 to 20% of the bucks harvested in our state are spikes. They're taken mostly in the state's heavily forested mountainous counties, areas with poorer soils that lack adequate calcium and phosphorus, two elements critical to antler growth. Overpopulated range can also impact antler growth in young bucks, because the limited food available in such places often cannot sustain both skeletal growth and antler development. Under these conditions, the bulk of the available nutrition is directed to skeletal growth, which takes precedence over antler development. While big bucks with large racks can be found almost anywhere, they tend to show up more frequently in our southeastern counties and the river valleys of western counties, places where soils are rich and where large amounts of unhunted private property apparently give bucks a chance to live more than a year and a half, the most common lifespan of a Pennsylvania buck. From late August and on into October, a wide variety of wild and agriculturally produced foods are available. Acorns and apples, grasses and pokeweed leaves, soybeans and field corn. It's a time of plenty, and deer, along with many other species, scramble to round up these nutritious fall foods. Sometimes the competition for certain foods is intense due to their limited availability, taste, or ease in gathering. Deer probably dedicate more time to feeding than any other activity, and in late summer and early fall, when the availability of highly nutritious foods peaks, deer are eating as much as their bodies will physically permit them to. This food is converted into fatty reserves, an energy supply that will help sustain them through the rut when physical activity increases significantly, and in winter when foods are limited. Does and their young continue to feed heavily, but the bucks are beginning to march to a different tune. Increasing levels of testosterone in their bodies are causing them to concentrate less on food and more on females. The higher the level, the more focused a buck becomes. Sparring is the first phase of rut activity. It begins shortly after bucks have removed the velvet from their antlers and may continue until does come into heat. These pushing contests seem to be used by bucks to establish dominance over others and to test their strength. Yearling bucks tend to spar more often and deeper into the rut than mature bucks. The older ones seem to have nothing to prove, and if they do, they can usually accomplish with an icy stare what younger bucks must prove through pushing. Bucks prepare for the rut by making antler rubs on trees. A rub is nothing more than a section of a sapling or small tree stripped of its bark, but it seems to have some sort of importance to other deer. They may be a form of communication, or the remains of an exercise bucks use to strengthen their neck muscles. Then again, rubs may be nothing more than a place where a buck polished his antlers or released some built-up energy. While making rubs, bucks leave a scent that sort of personalizes them. Deer that encounter these rubs will usually stop and inspect them. Some mature bucks start making rubs in early September. The majority of our bucks, however, seem to wait until October. Biologists suspect this happens because most of the buck population is made up of yearlings, which often go through physiological changes somewhat later than mature deer. If you're spending time outdoors any time from mid-October through December, there's a good chance you'll see another deer signpost, the scrape, a sure sign that whitetail courtship has begun. Bucks make scrapes by pawing a shallow depression in the ground, almost always under a low-hanging tree branch. They urinate on the dirt patch and often leave a hoof print in its center, possibly further marking it with a secretion from the interdigital gland located between the deer's split hoof. Bucks also pull down and mark the overhanging branch with secretions from their preorbital glands, found in the inner corner of both eyes. Urine and gland secretions are personalized scents used by deer to communicate. Interdigital glands lay down a scent trail. Deer urinate on their tarsal glands found on the hocks and let the strong-smelling liquid drip onto the scrapes. These scented secretions either stimulate or alarm deer. This is a time when bucks are preoccupied. They are often seen trailing a doe in heat, ignoring people, and even stepping out in front of cars. Bucks tend to make scrapes and rubs in lines, sometimes along ridges or creek beds, and sometimes along the edges of fields, logging roads, or swamps. These lines are almost always strategically located. They're made near feeding or bedding areas and the travelways between these areas. It's not known whether these signposts are territorial markers, but the bucks making them don't seem to run other bucks out of the area, unless, of course, they fail to offer the appropriate respect or chase the does passing through. These actions are often cause for fighting. Bucks encounter one another more frequently as the rut progresses because they often leave their usual haunts in their quest for does. During these searches, they invariably run into other courting bucks. Fights are usually the final chapter in a dispute between two bucks. More often than not, differences are settled with a stare, an aggressive approach with lowered antlers, or sparring. If a fight occurs, it's usually between bucks of somewhat equal size. Big antlers are an advantage, but so is a big body, because strength almost always determines who will win. Bucks don't routinely use antlers to gore or seriously harm each other in fights, but there are exceptions to this general rule. Just ask Wildlife Conservation Officer Len Groshek.
Last November, as a conservation officer in Bedford County, I received a report of an injured deer along Route 30 just outside of the town of Everett. I went there expecting to find a deer that was injured by a vehicle, but what I found was a little bit different. This buck here was out in the center of a field, standing in one spot. Deer kept pulling its head back towards its right side, and as I approached it, it would walk in a tight circle and then stand still again and pull its head back to the side. As I got closer, I noticed injuries on its side in the hindquarter, puncture wounds, and once I got close enough, I put the deer down. I approached it, and the first thing I noticed was this piece of antler sticking out of its forehead. There's an inch of broken antler on the outside of the skull and over 2 inches inside that penetrated the left side of this deer's brain. Combat between two buck resulting in death is not a common occurrence. Sometimes larger buck get their antlers locked and they die of exhaustion or possibly injuries, but most of the time one of the deer will assume a subordinate role and leave the area without injuries. This smaller buck here, obviously fighting with a larger buck, for some reason did not just turn and assume the subordinate role. Maybe it was just defending itself when the fatal injury occurred.
Does come into heat any time from September to January, but most breed in mid to late November. Bucks grunt to attract females. They also pursue does during their daily movements from feeding to bedding areas. Females in heat often visit scrapes and urinate on them. Bucks typically visit their scrapes every day or two. If a female has left a scented message on one, a buck will usually hang out in that area trying to find her. Bucks seem to have the ability to determine what stage of heat or estrus does are in. They do this by smelling urine released by the female, then performing what is called a lip curl. Biologists do not know for sure that bucks can make this analysis, but several studies have concluded there is a high degree of likelihood. At the height of the rut, dominant bucks run themselves ragged. By this time, most have abandoned their scrapes and spend all their time chasing females. Does run from their suitors until they are ready to breed. Then they allow bucks to approach. They display this willingness for only about 24 hours. Does not bred in this short period will again come into heat in about 4 weeks. Dominant bucks mate with as many females as they can. When a buck finds a willing doe, he hangs out with her for up to 24 hours, mating several times and chasing away other interested bucks. When the doe begins to refuse him, the buck moves on, looking for another willing female. By the time Pennsylvania's buck season opens, most does have been bred, assuring that next year's fawns will once again replace those taken in hunting seasons, killed on highways, and lost to winter. One of the hardest times of the year for deer and other wildlife is winter. Their survival through the year's 4 coldest months depends on their ability to conserve energy, find food, and to some degree escape predators. A deer's thick winter coat enables it to bed for many hours in cold weather without having to move. This helps it conserve energy. Deer also have less competition for food in most areas because hunters have reduced their numbers. This ensures available foods will last longer. Deer use food conservatively in winter. They seem to voluntarily restrict their food intake, even when plenty is available. Deer also show a knack for picking out the most nutritious foods. But don't expect to see this type of behavior on overpopulated range, where food supplies have been reduced and the most nutritious foods have already been eaten. Deer cannot conserve or pick and choose from food that isn't there. Even with all these edges and advantages, deer can still have a rough time of it in winter. Food is scarce. Deep snow, especially when it has a thick crust, restricts movements and complicates foraging for food. Deer may use up to 25% of their body weight if the availability of food or weather restrict feeding. In winter, deer usually move about less, bed for extended periods of time, and seek dense evergreen cover for protection from strong winds and icy precipitation. Each year, Pennsylvania loses deer to winter starvation and exposure. Most are young deer and those lacking adequate energy reserves. As a rule, the rougher the winter, the higher the losses. But there are exceptions. Take the winter of 1993 and 94, one of the state's worst ever for snow accumulation and cold temperatures. It was a winter in which we should have lost thousands upon thousands of deer. But our losses, although significant, were limited. An extremely large acorn crop throughout the state apparently helped deer store enough energy to carry them through the rough winter. The large acorn crop continued to provide deer with food when the snows melted in early spring. Also helping, deer populations were more compatible with their habitat than they had been in years. Although winter can represent hard times for deer, it's a time when calm returns to their world. The rutting season is over, and hunters are out of the woods. Both have caused deer to increase their movements and activities. Now, disturbances are limited to the occasional passing of a snowmobile or cross-country skier. The forest is quiet, except for the howl of winter winds and a large predator, the eastern coyote. Where eastern coyotes originated is anyone's guess. Photographic evidence documents they've been in Pennsylvania since at least the 1930s. Some researchers suggest that coyotes have been with us since colonial times. Others believe the eastern coyote is a cross between a western coyote and a Canadian timber wolf that migrated southward from Ontario over the last 50 to 60 years, into New York's Catskill Mountains and eventually into Pennsylvania. Coyotes are now a well-established member of the state's wildlife community. They've been sighted in every county but Philadelphia and appear to thrive in both rural and suburban areas. The highest coyote densities are still in our northern counties, where they first appeared in appreciable numbers. But southern populations seem to be steadily increasing. It's estimated the state's current coyote population numbers between 20 and 30,000. Although coyotes are carnivorous, they're also opportunistic feeders. They eat seasonal fruits and nuts, scavenge road-killed animals, and hunt a variety of wildlife, including mice, birds, rabbits, and groundhogs. They also prey upon domestic animals, like sheep, chickens, and cats. Over the last several years, a controversy over what effects coyotes have on the deer population has erupted in our state. Some people claim packs of coyotes are running down deer, while others insist they're killing most of the fawns. Former Game Commission biologist Arnie Hayden, who has studied coyotes for several years, has his own opinions.
Coyotes can and do kill deer, but not in the numbers that most people think they do. We have been running a food habit study on coyotes in Pennsylvania where we've been picking up scats. It indicates that 57% of the scats that we picked up do contain some kind of deer parts in them. Actually, this didn't surprise us because it's very similar to the states around us.
It's important to remember, though, that just because a significant number of coyote scats have deer parts in them, that doesn't mean coyotes have killed the deer they came from. The parts often came from a deer struck on the highway, remains left by hunters, or possibly one that wasn't recovered during the hunting seasons. To date, our limited research indicates that coyotes are not a major mortality factor on the deer population. We can't quantify their impact on deer numbers, but we believe it's no more significant than other mortality factors, such as deer lost to highways, crop damage, dogs, starvation, and poaching. Rest assured, though, we'll continue to keep an eye on eastern coyotes. When a deer population becomes too large for its habitat to support it, deer have a tendency to eat things they normally wouldn't and consume available foods more quickly. In these areas, a very distinct browse line often develops in the forest understory. This browse line marks the highest point deer can reach to obtain food. Wherever browse lines occur, most edible ground cover, tree seedlings, shrubs, and low-hanging tree branches have been eaten or picked clean. This plant destruction has a profound effect on other wildlife because it defines what vegetation will remain in a forest plant community, and what remains are usually the plants deer won't eat, and trees that have grown beyond the stage where deer can harm them. All wildlife has habitat preferences. Some species like fields or rocky areas, others like the forest understory or its canopy. The key ingredients of habitat are vegetation and terrain features. So it stands to reason that if a deer continually clip and consume certain types of vegetation, or they eat almost everything on the forest floor, they're robbing other wildlife of food, cover, and nesting sites. Deer often leave a peculiar mark on the land they inhabit, even when they do not exceed their range population limit or carrying capacity. It's a product of deer feeding, which is sometimes incredibly selective and other times a matter of grabbing whatever's available. Deer prefer eating tender shoots and sprouts over woody plants, but they eat woody plants and stems throughout the year. Plants sprouting in early spring are particularly vulnerable to deer because they're often all there is to eat for several weeks. Studies have been performed over the years that document just how destructive a large deer herd can be to a forest plant community. But when you consider how big deer are and their food requirements, that really shouldn't be too surprising. That big body requires plenty of food, especially when deer are preparing for winter, and deer work hard to meet their nutritional needs. Forces other than deer also influence forest composition. They include man, weather, destructive insects, and blights. In many cases, the changes brought about by these habitat manipulators are often beneficial to deer. Whenever large trees are removed, fall, or die, sunlight can more easily reach the forest floor, and vegetation that could grow in the shade sprouts. This is a change that almost always improves deer habitat because it increases plant diversity. Reverting farmland and private timber harvest also improve deer habitat because they pave the way for new plant life. And whenever there's new vegetation sprouting, you'll usually find deer. For its first 10 years, a forest will support more deer than any other forest age class because it's loaded with browse and tender shoots. The young forest eventually grows into pole timber and remains in this stage for the next 30 to 40 years. Pole timber supports fewer deer than any other type of forest. Deer can no longer reach tree branches, and the canopy has become thick enough to block sunlight from hitting the forest floor. With time, the trees grow into saw timber, which usually provides plenty of mass such as acorns and beech nuts. Saw timber supports more deer than pole timber, but not nearly as many as the young seedling sapling stands. However, saw timber provides deer food for decades. Seedling sapling stands mature into pole timber after about 10 years. Mast is an important food item for deer from fall to early winter. As these acorns fall to the ground, deer will shift their eating habits from browse and agriculture to this mast crop. Although deer may prefer some species, like this white oak acorn, they'll readily eat all that are available. They're an energy-rich food source that prepare bucks for the rut and all deer for the cold days of winter. A deer's keen sense of smell helps it find food, but it also serves two other important functions. It's used to track other deer and to check air currents for the smell of predators and man. Hearing also plays a critical role in the animal's self-defense. Any sound out of the ordinary generally causes a deer to stop, look, and listen. If the deer sees something suspicious, it may stomp one of its front hooves and do a head bob at whatever's bothering it. The tactic is used by deer to coax other wildlife and people to move, and it often works. Deer use their eyes to watch for sudden movement. They don't seem to be very good at picking out and identifying stationary objects, but they can detect movement for several hundred feet, and they have a very large field of vision. Whether deer can see color is an issue that has been debated for some time. Many researchers believe deer can't, because their eyes seem to lack the necessary equipment to see color. Some hunters will disagree. They say deer can pick them out when they're wearing fluorescent orange clothing. So far, no one has offered convincing proof that whitetails can or can't see color, and it doesn't look like the controversy will end anytime soon. Deer use their senses to do everything. It's their way of life. But deer do not have the ability to reason like humans. They tend to react to problems. One major problem they encounter is learning to cross roads. The bigger the road, the less the margin for error. Scores of deer annually make fatal mistakes in their attempts to cross. April and May almost always are two of the worst months for deer car accidents. Two others are October and November, months that coincide with the rut. In recent years, Pennsylvania's known highway deer mortality has annually been between 40 to 50,000 deer. Part of the reason for this is more vehicles are on the road than ever before. The other is the incredible number of roads in the Commonwealth. Only 8 states have more roads than Pennsylvania. Yet Pennsylvania ranks 32nd in geographic size among the 50 states. Highways twist and turn through our mountains and agricultural areas, bisecting habitat and often separating deer bedding and feeding areas. They're a headache for deer, especially young ones, but they do learn to deal with them. Highways are just one of the many obstacles whitetails have learned to adjust to on their long road to recovery in Pennsylvania. Over the course of Pennsylvania's history, deer have had to adapt to tremendous change. In the late 1800s, our state's once thriving population of whitetails was at the end of its rope. Their numbers had been decimated by unlimited harvest, timeless abuse, and habitat destruction. Deer seemed destined to follow the elk into extinction. What made things so difficult for deer was the lack of protection. They were hunted with dogs, trapped, jacklighted, shot over salt licks, and taken in unlimited quantities. Market hunters and settlers alike shot deer whenever they had the good fortune to find them in fall and winter. Many of them just assumed the deer herd could withstand their never-ending harvest. By the 1890s, however, they learned just how wrong they were. Pennsylvania was in the midst of being systematically stripped of its trees to fuel the growing demands of lumber, charcoal, and tanning companies when the reality of its deer shortage hit home. Hunters were spending days afield without so much as cutting a deer track. Just seeing a deer became front-page news. The situation was bleak. In response to the deer problem, sportsmen called for and got a Pennsylvania Game Commission. This new commission immediately went to work on the deer shortage. Deer were stocked, does were protected, and special management practices were begun. With time, the deer herd responded favorably. Interestingly, deer hunting never stopped during this rebuilding period. The secret was managing the breeders, or females. Today, deer management is still an evolving science because the world of the whitetail and our world is constantly changing. The deer population is critically dependent upon hunters because they help to manage it. Yet each year it's becoming increasingly difficult to manage deer because of modern problems such as posted property and safety zones. As human interests change, so does the landscape, and things like highway systems, shopping areas, housing developments, and industry. People also need more space today than ever. It's a common pattern in our state's history. As our population has expanded into new areas, so has the deer herd. Once found mostly in the state's mountainous areas, today, deer can be found almost everywhere. There isn't anything a deer will do without first using its senses to check if the coast is clear. And it serves them well. That's one of the reasons why so many Pennsylvanians enjoy hunting deer. They're quite a challenge. Over the past several decades, 1 million or so deer hunters have been heading afield each year in search of whitetails in our deer seasons. It's one of the state's oldest outdoor recreational pursuits, and annually pumps hundreds of millions of dollars into our economy. Every fall, deer hunting in Pennsylvania begins with the early archery season. It's followed by buck season, our most popular season, then antlerless deer season, and finally our late archery and flintlock muzzleloader season. Deer hunting is very important to Pennsylvanians for many reasons. Some consider it recreation, or a way to get venison for the table. Others see it as a reason for getting together with old friends or to visit their old stomping grounds. It's tradition, adventure, and a test of skills all rolled into one package. Deer provide recreation to more than just hunters. Each year, millions of people derive great enjoyment from deer by simply watching them. Some take drives in the country or go spotlighting at night to find whitetails. Some people go to great lengths to attract deer to their properties. They put out salt licks and feeders, plant special trees, shrubs, and grasses, and post their properties to keep disturbances to a minimum. To these people, deer provide a great deal of satisfaction. They're something large and very wild, but also very graceful and pleasant to look at. Each year, deer cause millions of dollars of property and crop damage in Pennsylvania. Most of this damage is often a direct result of having too many deer in a particular area. But the whitetail's eating habits also contribute to the problem. Deer like to stop, nibble, and go when their range has an adequate food supply. They usually don't strip clean or entirely consume wild or cultivated plants unless food has become difficult to get. It can be costly to farmers if deer are nipping off the tips of young corn ears or nibbling on and permanently scarring tomatoes or cabbage. This damage almost always results in a reduced or delayed harvest, and crop quality suffers immensely. Deer also seem to prefer a variety of foods when they're available. Deer often take a bite of this and a bite of that as they work a forest edge or farm fields. Schuylkill County farmer Baron Hetherington has noticed this behavior on several occasions.
We were out one night and we had red clover and tomatoes side by side, and a deer walked right along the edge of the field, right like this, and she'd nibble on the red clover and nibble on the tomatoes, and like a salad bar, back and forth. She was sort of like picking and choosing as she went. It was kind of amusing.
Deer have a 4-part stomach, just like a cow. When feeding, a deer usually collects and swallows food, storing it in its rumen, the largest part of the 4 stomach chambers. Later, when a deer is bedded, it regurgitates the food, or cud, chews it more thoroughly, grinding it down with its back teeth, and then swallowing it again. The food returns to the rumen, where it breaks down and then passes through the stomach's remaining areas. The deer's special stomach is an important asset during hunting season or when it's raiding crop fields. It allows the deer to collect food quickly in open areas and then retreat to cover where it can more thoroughly chew it. Deer seem most comfortable in open areas when escape cover is nearby, but they'll venture deep into the middle of a large crop field if that's where the food is. This is especially true when natural foods are not plentiful. Just ask Lycoming County farmer Carl Kepner about the time he was cutting his corn and the deer came calling.
Well, once in a while when they feed no acorns in the woods, they'll go in and eat it right up to your picking. I picked that flat field right in behind this one here. That's been 8-10 years ago. It was a drizzly day, about like today, rain off and on. Well, I started around the field the first time. There was 10 deer went in the field. Them deer was there till I got done picking. They stayed right in the field. They just never left the field. They stayed right there.
If you listen closely to farmers, they'll tell you things about deer you'll find hard to believe. Stories of how deer come through culverts under interstate highways to get to the fields, how they hide in fields by laying flat on their sides, and how they avoid chained dogs by casually walking just beyond their reach. Deer learn what their limitations are in agricultural areas and seem to take full advantage of everything they can get away with. They readily adjust to whatever hardships and inconveniences farmers impose. It's almost like you can't teach them a lesson. Farmers will tell you it doesn't matter how many deer you shoot for crop damage in a particular field, they'll keep coming back until the food is gone. And it's that tenacity that bothers farmers. It makes it seem as if their crop damage problems are unsolvable. Many farmers are also avid deer hunters. They enjoy the thrill of hunting as much as the next person. There's little doubt, however, that some deer hunting farmers have mixed emotions about deer. Lycoming County farmer Paul Katzmayer is one of them.
As a farmer, I guess it wouldn't bother me if you had to go to the zoo to see a deer. As a sportsman, why, I don't mind seeing some around. And I guess as a combination of the two, I have to put up with a little damage, but you know, to enjoy the deer hunting.
Farmer Carl Kepner feels the same way.
But 3 years ago it was, they hit me and hit me hard. I'd say a $1,000 bill wouldn't cover my damage. They cost you money, sure, but if you want to hunt, you got to put up with some of it. It's the way I feel.
Deer are masters at disguising their movements. In agriculture and suburban areas, they usually travel in a slow, deliberate fashion, using whatever cover is available to hide their activities. While moving, deer frequently travel in single file and communicate with one another by using their tails and body language. Deer at ease usually wag their tails, but when a deer freezes in its tracks and its tail flares or twitches, it means the animal is nervous or suspects something is wrong. Whenever traveling in single file, the lead deer, which is almost always a dominant doe, is the scout and guide. The rest of the deer watch her. If she lifts her tail horizontally or upright, it's the equivalent of a fire alarm. More often than not, the deer will quickly leave the area, usually in the direction they came from or into the wind. Every year, deer in Pennsylvania disperse or move out of the territory they were born in. The activity seems to be influenced by mostly social pressures from within the local deer population, or an instinctive urge, but may also be caused by habitat changes. Dispersal, especially among young deer, occurs most often in the spring when family groups break up. Bucks tend to disperse greater distances than females. Does tend to stay relatively close to the area they were born in. The distance a deer covers in dispersal depends on how far it must travel to find suitable habitat. Some go as little as half a mile, others may go up to 20 miles. A deer knows the area it inhabits like you and I know our neighborhoods. It knows where to find food, where to find shelter, and where it can rest in peace. This area is called a deer's home range. The size of a home range depends upon how far a deer must go for food and shelter throughout the year. As a rule, the range generally doesn't stretch for more than a mile in any one direction. Deer living in open areas usually have larger home ranges than those inhabiting the woods. Bucks tend to have larger ranges than does. Although they leave it occasionally, deer prefer to stay on their home range. Not even intense hunting pressure will chase them away from it for long, if at all. The deer stay or quickly return because they are familiar with their home range. They don't know every square foot of it, as some people would have you believe, but they do know it, and all of its advantages as well. And it's important that they do. Their survival is often dependent on this knowledge. In Pennsylvania, whitetails share the land with 12 million people who are continually manipulating and changing the landscape to their satisfaction. And yet, in the face of this constant change, the state's deer herd has held its own or increased. In some areas, this increase has been more than the land and residents can bear. Gettysburg is one of those places. The National Park Service has had its share of deer problems at the Gettysburg battlefield over the last 20 years. In fact, the problems are so severe now, according to natural resource specialist Hal Greenlee, that deer are impacting the park's ability to maintain the battlefield in its wartime appearance.
We have a mandate to try to maintain this area in its same relative condition and to interpret it to the public as to what happened here. We need the character of the agriculture and the woodlands to be able to interpret what happened here. It's pretty hard to visualize what happened here in 1863 unless you can get a feel for the terrain and the character of the land. The deer over the last 10, 15, or 20 years have increased 4 or 5-fold and are now impacting our ability to maintain that character. They are feeding so heavily in the woodlands that they're eliminating just about all of the regeneration. Whenever we plant corn or other traditional historic crops down here, the deer devastate those crops. And at times you'll see 50, 70, or 100 deer out actually grazing on a hayfield like cattle.
The battlefield at Gettysburg has been a refuge where hunting hasn't been permitted for more than 100 years. And for a long time that was fine, because the park didn't have a substantial deer population. But things have really changed in recent times.
The estimate here on this Pickett's Charge and on the Eisenhower farm is that we have about 120 deer per square mile. And it's been determined that we should not have more than probably 15 deer per square mile in this area. So you can see that 120 and 15 is a considerable difference.
Although Gettysburg's deer are an attraction for tourists, they're bad news for motorists traveling through the park and the farmers who lease lands from the Park Service to grow crops. To get an idea of how much crop damage occurs, the Park Service conducted a test.
We randomly placed 3 of these 25 square foot little fenced in areas in this field, and the deer did the rest. And as you can see here, the deer have eaten every stalk of corn down to knee high or down to the ground, except what they couldn't get at. By looking at the corn in the exclosures, you can see that every one of those stalks is 7 or 8 feet tall and have 1 to 2 ears of corn on them, large ears, and a farmer would expect in an area where there wasn't deer feeding to get 90 or 100 bushels of corn to the acre out of these fields. There's nothing here. There's nothing in this whole 3 acres other than what's in those exclosures. There's not a mature ear in this whole field. The deer have literally mowed it down.
It's not hard to understand why fewer and fewer farmers are interested in planting crops on lands leased from the park. They expect a return for their efforts, and at the moment, they know that's not possible at Gettysburg. The daily routine of deer varies from one location to the next. It's influenced mostly by human activities, the time of year, and weather. But other factors such as the rut, predators, and even insects can also affect how often, when, and where deer move. Deer are usually more active under the cover of darkness than at any other time. But they do move about in daylight hours, especially during the first few hours after sunrise and the last few before sunset. Some studies have also shown that deer are often active in daylight hours around midday and just prior to the arrival of bad weather. Violent weather almost always sends deer scurrying for cover, because the product of this weather, wind, rain, thunder, sleet, often impairs a deer's senses. Unless they're pushed, deer prefer to sit tight and ride the storm out. In many ways, deer deal with weather as we do. If it's hot, they hang out in cool spots like evergreen thickets and along creeks. If it's very cold, they find a sheltered area where they can soak up sunlight and avoid the wind. Insects can be a real irritation to deer, particularly when large numbers plague them. The problem is that deer's long legs, cloven hooves, and short tail aren't exactly good bug swatting and scratching gear. Deer can't even nip bugs with their front teeth because whitetails don't have upper front teeth. If twitching or head jerking can't get the job done, a deer may get relief by moving to a place where insects aren't as much of a problem, or taking a dip in a nearby creek or pond.
This deer tick is an arachnid many of us became familiar with when researchers discovered it was the carrier of Lyme disease, and more recently a disease called HGE. Both diseases, if left untreated, can cause serious health problems and in some cases death. Many of us assume that whitetails are the only wildlife host that deer ticks will attach themselves to, but that's not true. Nor is the belief that reducing a deer population will lead to fewer incidents of Lyme disease and HGE.
Deer ticks are not picky when it comes to finding a host. They'll climb on anything from mice to deer to people. But deer often pick up more ticks than other animals because of their large size and mobile lifestyle. It's not uncommon to find dozens or even hundreds of ticks on a deer. The size of an area's deer tick population is more closely related to habitat than the availability of hosts. Ticks, like most animals, prefer areas that offer the best living conditions. If deer numbers are reduced in a tick-infested area, greater numbers of ticks may appear on the remaining deer and other mammals found there. One last word about deer ticks. A good number of hunters each year worry about contracting Lyme disease if they cut themselves while field dressing a deer. Some also wonder whether the disease can be acquired by eating venison. To date, there have been no instances where an individual has contracted this disease under either of these conditions. About 70% of Pennsylvania's population reside in urban and suburban areas, and a large percentage of these people live in or around Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Allentown. Living with all these people in frequently congested conditions are thriving populations of whitetails. Every day, someone, somewhere in suburbia has an unexpected encounter with a deer. Sometimes it's not pleasant. Jack Kelly of Pittsburgh can attest to that. One day, Jack was driving down a road when he noticed something moving quickly toward him from his left.
And as I got up to it, it's riding right alongside me. I looked out, I noticed that it was a deer. His eyes was wild, and he was scared to death. Well, he ran beside me for, a few feet. And all of a sudden, he veered right into the car. He hit the door right about where the rearview mirror is on the driver's side. His head come up, banged on the windshield, and then he flipped. He went out of my sight. Next thing you know, he's on the roof. Now, a lot of noise up on the roof. I don't know what he was trying to stand up or what, but I'm looking, and I was looking in the rearview mirror. I see him slide down the window. He's laying on the trunk, kicking and jumping. So finally I get stopped, and he gets down on the ground, and I jump out. Well, he's getting up by the time I get out, and he shakes himself, looks, takes off. He seemed like he was in good shape.
Not everyone is as fortunate as Jack Kelly when deer and cars meet. Sometimes the injuries sustained are life-threatening, even fatal. It's a sad situation no matter how you look at it, but it's one of the consequences of having deer. There are others, especially in and around our metropolitan areas. Deer can cause a tremendous amount of damage to landscaped properties, vegetable and flower gardens, parks, and other natural areas in and around our cities. In some cases, damages have been estimated in excess of $10,000 for 1 year on some elaborately landscaped properties. Damage to lawns, ornamental shrubbery, and gardens is often closely related to the availability of natural foods. The more difficult it is to get food, especially the types deer prefer or want, the braver and less sensitive deer become about going into places that they'd usually stay away from. Francie Starr of the Bethlehem area has seen some of this behavior firsthand.
It's seasonal. In the spring, they seem to get attracted to lilies, daylilies, bulbs, anything like that that's sprouting up, ivy on the homes. They've attacked the ivy on this house, literally ripped it off. The summer, there's more I suppose, more things for them in the woods, so they're not as bothersome in the summer. In the fall, they love the mums, and they've taken the liberty of coming right up to the house, down steps, across terraces, eating the tops off mums. They jump fences to go after any green grass in the winter. They're very comfortable, and whatever's available to them, they'll go after it.
In the Pittsburgh suburb of Fox Chapel, similar conditions prevail, and in some cases they're worse, according to borough manager Bill Gordon.
We have had reports from individuals who indicate that they've lost thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of landscaping around their homes. This seems to occur primarily in the wintertime, but lately, as our herd has grown, it seems to be occurring throughout the year and is not being restricted to the winter months only. Well, there is one area of borough parkland that is renowned for the trillium that abound in the parkland, or at least used to be very abundant in the parkland. Every spring, the entire valley would be carpeted with a blanket of white flowers that would look like fresh snow. But last year, there was a significant change. There were no flowers. The deer had eaten them. The trillium, I understand, are a very sensitive plant, and it takes about 7 years for them to generate new growth. And there is concern that if this browsing continues unabated, that we could in fact lose the trillium for all time.
Despite the problems deer cause her, Francie Starr enjoys seeing deer on her property.
I love the deer. I mean, I get concerned when I don't see them. They're part of the property. I like the deer, but the damage that they do is a problem. This is their territory. They've been here longer than I have. And they're beautiful animals. They're hungry.
Homeowners use a variety of tricks and deterrents to keep whitetails from entering their properties. Some use scarecrows and noise-making devices. Others hang bed sheets and pie pans from strings. There are other options too, according to Ed Brayak, a professional landscaper in Fox Chapel.
We've tried almost everything that we found out in the market which they said would work. We've tried the human hair, we've tried the different detergent soaps, and none of that would work where they're hungry. They would eat right through it. We've tried all the sprays, including the hot sauce and sticker that go on. This will not work. So we've got out of that because wherever they're hungry, they go right through it, and they get used to it, they get adapted to it. So we've tried the netting after that. This worked for a while, and we will put the netting over the shrubs, and they will try to eat through the netting, and they get their teeth stuck and pull their netting right off, or they get it with their hooves or whatever they can, but they would learn to get the netting off and eat right through it. They would even chew through it. So after the netting, this didn't work. Now we're putting the fence in, and that's the only sure thing that I have that will keep the deer away.
Deer are enterprising creatures, and they seem to have a natural ability for getting into places they're not supposed to be in. They recognize opportunity quickly and seize it even faster. Deer have been observed using freshly plowed snowbanks to reach previously untouchable browse. They jump over 7-foot-high fences to get into yards. They have even been seen raiding bird feeders. Sometimes deer wander or are chased into a place where they know they don't belong. At these times, a whitetail doesn't seem as resourceful. This is probably related to being in unfamiliar territory, like this deer in the courtyard at Lycoming County College. But stress is also a factor. There are some situations deer are never comfortable in. Deer live in the nooks and crannies of urban and suburban areas. In daylight hours, they usually hang out where people don't. But when the hustle and bustle of city and suburban life slows, deer become more active. At dusk, deer are often on the heels of people leaving parks or their backyards. It's a routine, a way of life for animals living in the shadows of civilization. White-tailed deer can live almost anywhere, so long as they can find food, water, and cover. In places where there is a variety and abundance of natural foods, deer usually have fewer conflicts with humans. In areas where natural foods aren't as plentiful and the local herd is large, deer will often overbrowse their habitat and become regular visitors to cultivated fields and civilized settings. That's usually when the serious problems start. Most of us don't hate deer for the destructive things they do to the plants in our forest, fields, and yards, but we know the damage is often very costly and unattractive, and that it frequently leads to unsuitable conditions for deer and other wild things. We also know it's unfair to ask landowners and homeowners to tolerate the damage deer cause when it becomes excessive. None of us would look the other way as termites chewed up our house, and we can't expect farmers to ignore the deer devouring their cash crops, or homeowners to oblige the whitetails stripping their prized ornamental shrubbery. There has to be a balance in the complex relationship of deer, habitat, people, and other wildlife to minimize the problems we have talked about. The only way to achieve this balance is to keep deer numbers in line with their natural food supply. But sometimes that's not easy to do, because deer often inhabit areas where hunting is not permitted or where firearms cannot be used.
Few of us would argue that deer are beautiful creatures and an important natural resource. We're enchanted by their every move and derive great satisfaction in just knowing that they're around. But it's important to remember that you can have too much of a good thing when it comes to white-tailed deer. Coming to that realization and spreading the word are probably the most important things you can do for deer.
Informing and educating more people about deer and the never-ending need to manage them is the key to the whitetail's future. Knowledge helps people make informed decisions, and where deer are concerned, that's critically important, because each passing day they seem to be entering more of our lives. Deer are important to Pennsylvania, and we should never lose sight of that, regardless of how much trouble they get themselves into. But we must also be aware of their needs and realistic about how many we should have. In our constantly changing world, managing whitetails will always be a balancing act. The sooner more people realize that, the better off whitetails will be.